Thank you. This is Matt Littman with 97%. I'm the executive director, and we have a great panel. Right now, we have Congresswoman Lucy McBath from Georgia, Congresswoman Haley Stevens from Michigan, Congressman Seth Moulton from Massachusetts, and Congressman Steve Israel from New York. Congressman Israel, you're currently the head of the Cornell Institute of Politics. Is that right?
Former member of Congress,
former member of Congress from Long Island. So thank you for joining us. We're also maybe joined by Congressman Charlie Dent, who's doing a CNN panel now, and Congressman Eric Swalwell. So what we want to talk about is legislation. Why hasn't it passed? What could we do to get there? And Congresswoman McBath, I thought I would start with you because you had a terrible family tragedy, and then you got involved, you joined Everytown, Moms Demand Action, and then you became a member of Congress. And I'm curious, did you think that, and it would be our hope that with you in Congress that there would be more action taking place? So how do you feel about it versus what you kind of expected when you got into Congress a couple of years ago in terms of gun issues?
Well, Matthew, thank you for that question. And to be honest with you, I never expected to be in Congress. I had assumed I would still be as an advocate working, with the grassroots, mobilizing and organizing with Moms Demand Action and Everytown for Gun Safety. To be honest with you, I didn't know what to expect once I got to Congress. What I knew, though, is that I wanted to make sure that I was expressing as much of my voice and my ability to try to really move the needle on gun violence prevention in Congress with the very colleagues now that I work with. They're my colleagues. I was doing all of a lot of lobbying with them beforehand, trying to move the needle on gun safety. So I have to say that it is a lot harder to be able to create the policy and change. I think when you are working on the ground, the grassroots, mobilizing, and as a survivor and as a victim myself, we have this sense of urgency that we see every single day what's happening in communities around the country. We want to get it done. We want to save as many lives as we can. But to really look at it realistically, we know the change is slowly evolving. It is a culture that we're having to change, and it takes time to do so. So that is probably the thing that has been maybe the most distressing to me, is that each and every day that we are not enacting these safe policies to keep people alive, people are dying.
Right. There was a shooting today, for example, in Idaho, in a middle school where 3 people were shot. Congressman Moulton, you're known also for working in a very bipartisan way and with a lot of moderate Democrats, and we need moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans to get legislation passed. We've been able to do it in the House and not in the Senate. Do you see us gaining more support as time goes on?
Thanks, Matt. It's an honor to be here, and especially with such distinguished colleagues. My experience with guns is personal in a different way. I certainly haven't suffered an incomprehensible tragedy like Lucy, but I had to use guns for my job as a United States Marine infantry officer over 4 tours in Iraq. I've seen the effects of gun violence firsthand. I certainly know it has no place in our schools or our communities. And so I've tried to work with anyone who's willing to work on this issue, not just moderates, not just Democrats, but really anyone who sees the common sense here that the vast majority of the American people, Democrat, Republican, Independent alike, all see. And yes, things are moving in the right direction, but it's so painfully slow. And in some ways, we've moved backwards because, back in the 1930s, the NRA was founded as a gun safety organization to try to help with issues like this. Now, of course, its lobbying power in Congress is what fundamentally prevents any progress. So are we moving in the right direction? Yes, but we're not moving quickly enough. We need to do much more to save lives.
And I should also mention that the NRA was actually founded to help people learn how to shoot. That was the aspect of gun safety. In Europe, they found that people were better able to shoot than they were in the United States. So that's how it was founded in, I think it was in Greenwich Village that the NRA was founded. Congressman Israel, you also, sorry, go ahead.
It's amazing that we expect everyone to take driving courses, go through a test, and get a license to drive a car. And yet for a device that's literally designed to kill people, we don't require any of that.
Well, it's interesting that you say that when you talk about driver's licenses, because I believe there's just about the same amount of deaths from violence with a gun on a yearly basis as there is deaths from driving. It's almost the exact same number. Congressman Israel, you definitely work in a bipartisan fashion. You're doing a lot of that at Cornell and teaching people about it. How do you see this versus when you were in Congress? Do you see progress being made?
Well, first, Matt, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity as a former member to join such an illustrious panel. I enjoyed serving with Congressman Moulton. We served together. I'm sorry that I did not have the opportunity to serve with Congresswoman McBath and Congresswoman Stevens, although I would have loved to do that. I think I can kind of answer with one moment, one experience that I had with a Republican member of Congress. I actually wrote a novel about the ridiculous and absurd power of the gun lobby. It's called Big Guns. And so I wrote this while I was in Congress, and I used to listen very carefully to what my colleagues were saying. We were in an Appropriations Committee markup one day, Matt, and we offered these amendments: no fly, no buy, strengthened background checks, common sense language that had the support of 80% of the American people. And every one of those amendments went down in a partisan vote. And so after one of these sessions, I took aside a Republican colleague and said, listen, I don't get this. I've seen the polling in your district.
Right.
80% of your constituents support these things. And this is what he said. Yes, it's true. 80% support it. It's the 20% who don't who will cost me my election in a primary. So it's all about voter intensity, in my view.
Well, that's interesting because some people say it's the NRA's money that causes people to not vote the way that their constituents might want them to vote. I would also say, though, that it's the power of that 20% that you mentioned, which is not necessarily about money, but it's about the intensity of that voter.
It is about voter intent. Well, it's about both. It's about money and voter intensity. It's about those two things. You know, we Democrats were a very forgiving lot. We'll forgive our member of Congress for voting against us on guns, but voting with us on climate. That 20%, that pro-gun vote, they will not forgive a member of Congress for voting loopholes, you know, to change loopholes or universal background checks. They will not forgive that vote, even if that member votes with them 99% of the rest of the time. And it's good to see my former colleague Eric Swalwell is now on.
Congresswoman Stevens, you are part of a coalition in the House that works specifically on gun issues. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Yes, I am. Yep, I'm on the task force and the caucus with Mr. Mike Thompson, and something that Lucy McBath also leads as well.
So for the people who don't know, you know, they know you're on specific committees, but explain the difference between being on the task force. What does that entail, and how does that help us get gun issues in the forefront?
Yeah, well, because I'll talk to my freshman colleague from the class of 2018, Miss Lucy McBath, about this a lot, because she had the courage to run, to win, and to lead in the House. And she said, Haley, I'm going on to judiciary. Now, my dream committee was science and ed and labor. That's also a committee Lucy and I are on. But you get the task force abilities, the caucus abilities to do the work, to lean in on the issues, bring the stakeholders together, even though I'm not in judiciary marking up the bill. And yes, I remember I was on the floor of the House and someone was trying to get me to vote for a Republican amendment that was going to soften HRA, you know, our gun safety bill. And I literally looked this colleague in the face and I said, listen, I ran to actually, you know, drive the NRA crazy on this stuff because I'm sick of their grip on just even this common sense stuff about enforcing the laws that we have on the books and putting into place those common sense gun safety bills that we need to get done. And look, it's really quite transformative too for those of us. You know, I'm from Michigan. I flipped a seat. And yet I was very clear with my voters the whole time I was running that enough is enough. And if you elect Haley Stevens, I'm going to get on these caucuses and we're going to do this work in the House.
Well, let me ask you, you're in a very divided district, I would say, right? Very close Democrats and Republicans. Does this, working on this issue, I know you feel strongly about it and you're doing it because you think it's the right thing. Does it harm you politically? Can I ask that question?
So this is where an organization like 97%, I think, is so symbolic and frankly indicative of what is taking place in a district like mine. I represent a suburban district right outside of Detroit. We don't like seeing the gun violence in Detroit, just like we don't like seeing gun violence in our own communities. We just lost an almost graduated high school student to a suicide by a gun in my district. And the conversation I have with gun owners and with people who are former law enforcement or existing law enforcement is that they don't want to see this anymore. I've had these conversations even at shooting ranges. And, you know, of course, the media will try and shape those in a bunch of different ways. But really, the conversation is, yeah, we want to have gun safety and we want to stop the violence. And I loved what you said, Matt, about, you know, the 40,000 lives that we're losing every year to gun violence, the 40,000 lives we're losing every year to automotive accidents. But we have an industry. And if you go over to GM or Chrysler that's around the corner from my house, they'll tell you we're trying to get to 0 deaths. I need the gun industry to start saying that. We've got to get to 0 gun violence deaths in this country. This is what every single one of us here is working really hard on in the United States Congress, and we've got to be unafraid.
Thank you. Congressman Swalwell, thanks for joining us. Good to see you again. You know, one of the things is that the Biden administration has put out some good information. They've appointed somebody, or they're trying to get somebody as the head of ATF who would help with gun reforms in all likelihood. Do you see the Biden administration as being helpful? And what would you say is possible with Joe Biden as president? You're muted, Congressman.
Matt, I spoke to the president last week at the joint address to Congress, and I thanked him for the work that he's already done on this issue. And you know, in classic Biden fashion, he grabbed my arm, pulled me closer, and said, "There's a lot more that we can do." And he promised me that he, recognizes how many families are counting on him to do that. And so, yes, I mean, there's executive orders, and the ghost gun issue is proliferating. We saw it yesterday in Philadelphia, the seizure of a number of ghost guns at a residence with also drugs and, large amounts of cash. So, the people are starting to recognize how they can get around detection. So that issue is escalating. So thank God for that executive order. I'm pushing legislation that the president talked about in the joint session, which is how to take guns away from abusers. So right now, you're on the honor system in America if you are a domestic abuser, where in a domestic abuse relationship, you're 5 times more likely to die from homicide, die by gun than in someone who's not in a relationship like that. And the problem, though, is if you say are in Texas and you're arrested for domestic violence and you go to the court, you're on the honor system. The judge will just say you're not allowed to have a firearm, but we have no way of knowing whether the person has a firearm. And, the sheriff's office is not going to go to every domestic violence home and take inventory. And so my legislation would have us, kind of have a way of a federal approach to this so that domestic violence abusers are more protected. But I just want to congratulate 97% on its launch, and Stacey and Adam and you, Matt, thanks for stitching together this coalition.
Well, much appreciated. When we talk about the different laws, Congressman, by state, for example, there are very strict gun laws in Illinois and in Chicago, but you could bring in a gun from Indiana. They're not stopping you at the state border. Do any of you have a thought about the universal background checks issue and how important that might be? Because we're not going to go from 42,000 gun deaths a year to 0. Yeah. We could lower the number of gun deaths significantly through things possibly like background checks, red flag laws, things like that. And anybody can chime in, but where do you think?
We did a study in Alameda County where I was a prosecutor before coming to Congress, exactly what you pointed out, because a common hit on gun safety laws as well. Chicago's got the most gun violence deaths, and they have the toughest laws in Illinois. Or, Oakland has high homicide rate, and California has tough gun laws. So we wanted to look at that, and to the credit of the district attorney in our county, she did a study on all the guns that had been seized and all the cases they were prosecuting in the past 5 years, and 50% of the firearms had come from Arizona or Nevada. And so places that have, up until recently, Nevada passed background checks, but for a very long time, they had very loose gun laws. So you're only as safe as the gun laws in the states around you.
Congresswoman McBath, that reminds me, we had seen something that said that in Atlanta, you're not allowed to bring your gun into a stadium. So people were leaving their guns in their cars, and then those guns were getting stolen out of the cars. Mm-hmm. Right. And so it's, it's part of that concealed carry. You're allowed to walk around with things, not necessarily into a stadium. Do you see any hope for getting these issues passed through Congress?
Absolutely, Matthew. And I do need to say that, 97%, you're doing some phenomenal work. And as I think you and I briefly discussed, is that the thing is that we're needing to talk to the demographics of people that need to join in on these discussions. And that is gun owners. That is law-abiding gun owners and hunters and gun enthusiasts and skeet shooters. I mean, those are the individuals that need to be brought into the fold with these discussions. Bringing them into these discussions really helps us understand better ways to infiltrate and then find, ways to be able to pass these pieces of legislation. And yes, I do believe it's going to happen. But, like even here within the state of Georgia, everyone knows what's happening here. And, after the spa shootings that we had here, there were statewide calls for, of course, more gun safety legislation, safety measures. But then, of course, here in Georgia, they did just the opposite. I mean, instead, Republicans put forward, measures which expanded access to guns. While the Democrats, we were so busy trying to introduce pieces of legislation such as a 5-day waiting period and things of that nature. So it's a matter of continuing to put forth policies, and it's going to be an expansive number of policies. It's not one policy that's going to change the culture. So it's like chipping away at this huge, dangerous culture that we have, just one piece of legislation at a time. It will happen. It is not going to happen overnight. This culture has been brewing for the last 30, 35 years, and it's going to take a long period of time to state by state, in combination with all the federal policy that we can enact, hopefully with the help of the Republican Senate, to really chip away at the gun culture. And it will happen, though, but it is changing a culture, and people have to remember that. Policy changes only happen after there's been a cultural shift. Right. And any cultural shift we've had in this country, whether it be for LGBTQ rights or whether it was for women's rights to choose what's best for their body. I mean, these have all been cultural shifts and changes with a lot of organizing and mobilizing and people, and state and local authority, those leaders, and also people on the ground mobilizing, and federal policy that has changed the culture. And that takes a great deal of time and effort.
So thank you. And so when we talk about gun owners, Congresswoman, and I'll direct this one to you, Congressman Moulton. We did a lot of studies of gun owners, surveys, and we found that gun owners mostly agree with non-gun owners, right? 75% of gun owners, for example, support universal background checks. But what gun owners say, and they're right, is that they're often talked down to, so they don't trust the messengers. How do we do a better job of talking to gun owners who seem to mostly want the same things as non-gun owners?
Well, at first, I think we need to acknowledge that point, and this has happened in the past. I remember long before I came into Congress, but I was a Marine, seeing this article in the paper with a photograph about a Democratic member of Congress advocating for a gun law. And she had a display of assault rifles. And, with my knowledge of guns, I quickly noticed that one of the assault rifles she had the safety off, which is just like a basic violation of firearm safety. What's that?
Was this Congresswoman Bowler?
Oh, I'm not sure. I don't remember honestly who it was. But the point is that there has been a history of people talking about gun laws who don't know much about guns, and that is something that we should change, and we should bring in people. I was proud to be a part of a veterans group that met in Washington a couple of years ago to talk about how veterans can be more active in this effort. And there are a lot of veterans across the country, of course, who support the exact same common sense gun laws that we're talking about. But I asked the room at lunch, how many Republicans do we have here at lunch? And there were like two hands out of a room of 200 that went up. So we do have to do more to bring the other side into the discussion. As we've detailed in this call, it's not enough just to get the Democratic base on board or Democratic elected representatives. We've got to get Republican votes on this issue. And common sense background checks are such a sensible step. We were talking about this earlier, Matt, and I was thinking about Japan. In Japan, you can own a gun, and they have a good number of people who do. Japan has about 130 million people. So based on our gun death rates, you'd expect them to have, I don't know, maybe 15 or 17,000 gun deaths per year, but they have fewer than 100. And it's just because they have really stringent background checks to make sure that people who get guns and own guns are qualified to do so. It's not that difficult. It doesn't take away the Second Amendment freedom of having a gun. I carried grenades every day in Iraq, and I feel perfectly safe carrying grenades. I would feel perfectly safe with grenades on my chest right here, right now. But I don't think the rest of my family would. We've made a decision in America that we're not going to allow people to walk around with grenades. And let me tell you, if you need an assault rifle to kill a deer, you don't need an assault rifle. You need some shooting lessons. What we're talking about here is pretty reasonable, and it works.
Congressman Israel, first of all, I know somebody's making a good point because I see you nodding your head. So that's
I can't agree strongly enough about the need for advocates for sensible gun reforms to learn how to message. And we actually tested messaging on this. I chaired the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, and we tested messaging on this. And look, Republicans tend to message to the gut, to the amygdala, and Democrats tend to message to people's prefrontal cortex, rationality. So Republicans say, they're going to take your guns away. And Democrats tend to say, here's our 42-point plan on how we're going to have a better society. When we tested messages, for example, saying, look, I support the Second Amendment. Number one, I support the Second Amendment. But does it make sense for somebody to be able to get a cop-killing bullet as easily as they can? Can we at least agree on that? When you change the framing, you can bring people over to our side.
Right. So I think part of the question is, how do we change that framing? Because, for example, on the left, there are people who believe no one should own a gun. And then on the right, you see, very far right, you would see, they did this on a show on Showtime, people saying that 4-year-olds should be trained in how to shoot in school, right? So neither of those are happening, but in the middle is pretty much everybody else. So how do we change this? A lot of talking from you, Congresswoman McBath, as well, about that cultural issue. So how do we change this on a cultural level so that we're not listening to that very loud 3%, but we're listening more to the 97% who agree?
I think, as I've said all along, having, as a survivor, and trying to get people to understand that, survivors and people that are being affected by gun violence every day, we're not numbers and we're not statistics. We're real life human beings. And what I do say to them is that, first and foremost, I do support the Second Amendment. I say that. And I always start with my story that actually, and I think it's always telling our stories. Stories have so much power and impact to be able to change a person's heart, because changing this culture is truly changing a person, one person at a time. But getting them to understand that, yes, I want you, the law-abiding gun owner, to have access to a firearm, one, to protect yourself. That is your Second Amendment right, and I believe in that right. But two, if you're a hunter or a gun enthusiast, I want you to be able to do those things, you, the law-abiding gun owner. But would you not agree with me, as a law-abiding gun owner, that, you don't feel safe in your communities, you don't feel safe? Help me, you, the law-abiding gun owner, to feel that way. Help me to take off the street those individuals who should not have access to guns, if they are domestic abusers or if they're people with criminal intent, have criminal behavior, and help me to help even you keep your children safe. Do you keep your guns locked up in your home? Do your children have access to your firearms and ammunition? Help me to help you so that you, the law-abiding gun owner, never feels like you have to use your firearm. That's what it's all about. We want you to be able to have access to your guns and continue to be that enthusiast. But would you not agree with me that we have, a public health crisis here that only collectively all of us together can make sure, if we're working together, we can make sure that you don't become me. It's just having those really difficult discussions, finding that common thread there and disarming them, no pun intended, but disarming them from the very beginning, just so they will at least listen to you and hopefully hear you. Those discussions are hard to have. But there again, they have to be had. And that I just think is finding that common thread and not throwing statistics and numbers at them. They don't want to hear that, and they're going to shut you out.
Congressman Dent, I think you're joining us by phone. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you clearly.
Thanks for joining. I know you were just on CNN, and I appreciate you coming over and joining us. So if you're hearing the conversation, we're talking about the fact that so many gun owners agree with non-gun owners on this issue, yet the big pieces of legislation that almost everyone agrees on have not passed. So the question would be, what can we do about it? What are we missing? How are we missing something in terms of speaking to gun owners?
Well, let me start by saying that on the issue of, say, universal background checks, and just to give you some perspective, I served in the Pennsylvania General Assembly back in the 90s when we had a Republican governor, Republican General Assembly. And when we implemented the instant check system back then, we expanded that system to include private sales of all pistols. And we had a negotiation. We brought everybody into the room, including the NRA and the gun control groups at the time. And we worked out an agreement. And what's changed, though, is that the politics of these outside groups like the NRA, back then they felt they could negotiate, but now they're worried about losing members to the Gun Owners of America or some other groups. So if they were to enter into a real negotiation, the fear that they have is that they will lose members. So that put them now in a position where they don't even try to negotiate. They just say no. And I think that's the challenge. But we found in Pennsylvania that gun owners had no problem whatsoever being subjected to a background check for a private sale of a pistol. Not an issue. This was in '95. There was virtually no blowback from anybody, and none, zero. And so what they're proposing now, say on the Toomey Mansion or some version of that, universal background checks, and that would include, of course, internet sales. It would seem to me that would also have virtually no impact on law-abiding gun owners, and most of whom would have no problem whatsoever engaging in that kind of a check of a private sale.
I'm of the belief that if background checks passed through Congress and became law, basically no one would ever notice. And it would become law, it would just become the law of the land, and it would not become a big deal. And this fight would become about other issues, not background checks.
Well, the bigger problem you have on the background checks is on the mental health side, making sure that the mental health providers are actually providing the appropriate data, getting the HIPAA exemption, which I think actually Toomey Mansion did do, and other background check bills have done the same thing, making sure that information is inputted. That has always been the big problem with the check system, from my perspective. I mean, I think the law enforcement community is much better about making sure that felons and all the other prohibited persons are not allowed to purchase. But I think the challenge is going to be making sure that the the healthcare community is doing what they need to update the system.
Do we have, from our current members of Congress in the current legislation, is there a mental health care aspect to the legislation?
Well, I'd like to say is that, one of the things that I wanted to include in my extreme risk protection order, which, of course, President Biden is now enacting as an executive order for states to be able to enact this legislation if they want to. One of the concerns I had is that I thought that was really the missing piece, the missing link. If you're going to give families that have a loved one that's exhibiting signs of being in crisis, of course, giving them the ability, the family, the ability to go to law enforcement and to petition the court. What I wanted to be able to do is include in that petitioning the court someone who, a behavioral specialist or someone that can actually from the medical community identify that this person is indeed in crisis. Because I think that's just the added element that you need if you're going to petition the court to have those guns removed from that individual. But there again, protecting their Second Amendment rights, making sure that it's not just a decision that we think we're making. it is a medically sound decision that has been prescribed by someone in the medical community that can ascertain whether or not this person really is in crisis and should have those guns taken from them for whatever period of time that is. That's what I really believe is missing. This element is missing, having a medical professional there to truly make that diagnosis, because that's the first thing that the Republican Party and the NRA card members say is that, well, that infringes upon my rights, but let's protect their Second Amendment rights by adding in that additional layer of support. And that's what truly I would love to see with the extreme risk protection order.
Congresswoman Stevens, I think at the beginning of the Trump administration, he had an executive order that made it easier for people who were not doing as well mentally is the best way I could say it, to get guns. And that was at the beginning of the Trump administration. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, and part of this, right, is if we want to go back to talking about culture, and this is a perfect example of this, Matt, is if we aren't going to pass the laws that ebb away at gun violence and implement prevention, then we are essentially condoning this distorted reality that we are living in, that we are not safer with this many guns. And as an American who has felt terrorized by gun violence, not because I'm a survivor of it, but because I grew up going to summer camp where I did riflery, and then Columbine happened, and then there wasn't any more riflery, and then Virginia Tech happened, and then Trayvon Martin's murder happened, and Lucy's beloved son Jordan Davis, and you remember. And we say his name because we remember Jordan, and we remember where we were when these horrible acts of gun violence took place, including Sandy Hook, which is always used as the example, the rudder of the fact that the unthinkable, the unspeakable happened not in an isolated way, but to a classroom, to educators, to the youngest and most precious in our society, and yet no law was passed. And there's a psychology to passing laws, right? There's a psychology that we are going to say, you know what? Yeah, because golly gee whiz, this just feels a little unsafe. So we're going to, we see this with the duck boats to automobiles to any other little thing that is necessarily impacting our safety, albeit the guns in this country. And it doesn't need to be, right, so complicated, and we need all hands on deck. And this has got to call to, and this is why 97% yet again, and the gun owners, and here's what we're seeing at the tipping point. It's not just because I'm the Congresswoman that everyone's changing. It's that I'm out talking to parents who are like, why in God's name is my kid going through an active shooter training drill? I'm a gun owner, but I don't want to see this level of stuff. Yeah, let's make change. And you're right. Maybe there could be a quiet passage of a law, and I don't know, does that really affect anything? But having the full force, right? And this is the power of being federal lawmakers. That we are responsible for passing the nation's laws. And with that also becomes the tipping point on culture. Because as Lucy mentioned, if we hadn't done everything on women's rights, if we hadn't, last year we were celebrating suffrage, and recognizing 100 years of suffrage. If we didn't see Roe v. Wade come into play, we wouldn't have had the culture change that comes with it. And so that is why, and we've all got to remember this and continue to lean in on the political activities. And I'm not giving some sort of political speech here, but this is why when you look at thin majorities in that, there's great academic research on fragile majorities and things like that. But the gun safety conversation in America has got to continue to propel lawmakers forward who are willing to lead and say that we will have unity in this country when we have delivery.
Right. And I think the thing that people find very disheartening, for example, we have Fred Gutenberg on later today. I think all of you know Fred at this point, right? And so Fred's daughter, Jamie, when he tells the story about her being shot at Parkland, it's just impossible. You feel so much for him and his family. It's just terrible. But like you're talking about with Sandy Hook, nothing happened, right? Nothing changed. Parkland, not much has changed. So what do we need to do differently? And I throw this out to the group to make that change, because, these stories keep happening. They're beyond belief.
Matt, I think the tipping point in this movement will be law enforcement. And I say that as a brother to 2 police officers and the son of a police officer and someone who worked with police. They're not with us on this issue. Not only are they not with us, they actively work against us. And it has taken me a long time to understand why my brothers, who have literally been shot at, why they would oppose a lot of the gun safety reforms that have been proposed. And to them, part of it's pessimism, that they believe that even if we were to enact all these laws, they deal with the worst. And, it's the old saying, if you get rid of guns, if you take the guns, only the good guys will follow the rules and the bad guys will be the ones left with the guns. Many in law enforcement are gun owners. And so they fear that if they were to leave law enforcement, they would no longer be able, to keep their firearms. And so I think if we can find a way to connect with law enforcement and to get them on our side on these issues, because and I tell my brothers, the reason I care so much about this issue, it's a selfish reason. It's because I fear that one day they could be killed by a firearm because of their line of work. And with so many dangerous weapons out there in the hands of so many dangerous people, that is more and more likely every day. But they don't even look at it that way. They look at it as we could never solve the problem, that it's beyond being solved. So you're really only going to affect the good guys. And we have to figure out a way to get them on our side, because I think they can be so effective and they could be such powerful advocates for us in this fight.
Well, 23,000 of the 42,500 deaths last year were from suicide, right? So that's, if we're able to just that issue itself, sometimes we get these 2 issues confused. But with 23,000 people committing suicide, if you try to commit suicide in any other way, the odds are you're not going to be able to do it. If you try to commit suicide with a gun, 90% you're going to be able to do it. I think when we talk about law enforcement, I feel as though they're talking more about that other 20,000 or so people in those types of shootings with a handgun, usually with a pistol, than they are suicides. Do we ever see, like Congressman Moulton, you deal a lot with veterans, and there's a high suicide rate often amongst veterans. Do we ever see separating these issues in any way in terms of being able to get people to advocate for gun reforms?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that there are a lot of people, many of them Republicans on the other side of the aisle, who use mental health as an excuse to not do gun laws. And they just say, we don't need gun laws, we just need to address mental health. And then they never vote for money to put into mental health, but they just use this as an excuse to not support gun laws. So it is important to recognize that while we can do a lot to address the mental health crisis, specifically with suicide in America, by having better gun laws, so simply limiting the access to guns for people who have a mental health crisis, that will save lives unquestionably. There are a lot of suicides that wouldn't happen if someone didn't have easy access to a gun. At the same time, you can't use mental health as an excuse. And we do have a lot to do on mental health. I've been working on it very strongly. We have, I was proud to just pass a bipartisan bill establishing a 3-digit mental health hotline that will be implemented next year. I mean, that alone will save thousands of lives, because people who are having a mental health crisis won't have to go find a phone book for the suicide hotline number. They'll know what to call. Just like you don't have to look for a phone book when your house is burning down in the middle of the night. You just know you dial 911. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of common sense gun reform that we can do. And I just want to make another point on this, which is that everyone here agrees that we need to have federal reform. You can't have strict gun laws in Illinois and then everybody just brings in guns from Indiana. But having said that, it's also important to recognize that strict gun laws in states that have them do have an effect. We have pretty strict gun laws in Massachusetts. I mean, you can still get a gun license. I have, but that doesn't mean that we don't have the lowest we have the lowest gun violence rate in America because of those restrictions. I have a chart in my office that just shows, it ranks the states by how strict their gun laws are, And it's a very clear graph that shows that gun violence deaths are lower in states that have stricter gun laws. And that doesn't mean that Massachusetts doesn't allow you to own a gun. It doesn't mean the Second Amendment doesn't apply here. We're just more careful, and it helps.
Very good. Congressman Dent, in Pennsylvania, your state, you have a senator, a Republican senator, who's helped a lot and pushed gun legislation. Do you see the Republican Party in some ways as moving a little bit further to the right? Do you see the Republican Party, we talk about this coalition that Congressman Mike Thompson has. Do you see the Republican Party becoming more moderate on gun issues, or do you see the Republican Party becoming more to the right on gun issues?
Well, I'd like to say it's becoming more moderate on the issue of firearms. I would probably be, wrong to say that. That said, I still think there is some hope to at least persuade those. I'm going to say like a Brian Fitzpatrick from suburban Philadelphia. He's on board, and there are others. You have to identify Republicans from those swing districts, who are more moderate in tone and temperament and ideologically. And I think you will find some partners on those issues for, reasonable gun safety measures like the universal background checks, red flag laws, those types of things. I think you'll be able to get their support. So that's where I think the future is. Obviously you have Pat Toomey, who's been very outspoken, and it didn't hurt. Frankly, it helped him in his election in 2016 that he had taken the position that he did. It's interesting to note that, Donald Trump and Pat Toomey both won Pennsylvania in 2016, Toomey by a larger margin. And it was interesting that Toomey did much better in the suburban counties than Trump did. And I think in no small part because of his leadership on the issue of universal background checks.
So we also have a bunch of questions in the chat. Is it okay if I throw out some questions to the group from this chat?
Matt, can I just what Charlie just said? Hi, Charlie. I think part of the problem, though, is that those moderate Republicans like Charlie Dent or Congressman Peter King, whose district was next to mine on Long Island, who voted against Democrats on almost everything but sponsored no fly, no buy, they're leaving. They've left. There are fewer and fewer moderate Republicans on Capitol Hill right now, fewer who are willing to engage with Democrats on the issue. And so probably the best thing that can happen on this debate is to elect more moderate Republicans who are willing to take a position in support of protecting the lives of their constituents.
Exactly. Very good. Thank you, Congressman. So one of the questions we get from Mary Bernstein at the University of Connecticut, one of the speakers said that in districts where 80% support background checks, it's the 20% that matter. She says we won't reach that 20%, so what do we do? That's a great question, right? She feels that we can't reach that 20%. So I don't agree, but do you feel differently? So I throw that out to the group.
Well, I think one thing on that is you have to have the courage and the willingness to lead. And I know we're here talking about one exclusive and enormous matter, but if you see what's shaking out right now, where the Republican conference in the Congress is going through yet again another leadership election to try and oust the number 3 Republican, Liz Cheney, because she refuses to say that the election was fraudulent, and she calls it out as a big lie and all this and that. And there's a conversation about the willingness to lead, though. So Liz Cheney is willing to lead, right? She's willing to look very honestly to her constituents and say X, even though, by the way, she votes with the former president. I think she voted with him 97% of the time, but that's still not good enough, right? Because she's not admitting, she's not going to give into a big lie. And so I think to something that Charlie is saying, as well as Mr. Israel, which is very timely, is how do we get back to the honest brokering in our elected leadership? And, I know, again, Lucy McBath is a classmate of mine, but, Seth Moulton and Eric Swalwell, who also got there, kind of paving the pathway, is opening up some different channels and things like that. That how do you take that litmus test? And I often thought it was, being from Michigan and all this, I thought, well, we just need to elect more people with a Midwestern affliction, we should just be able to talk to each other. And then, lo and behold, it's not that you get to Congress and can't talk to your colleagues. This is something Steve was just saying really nicely, but we're beholden to other interests, if it's social media interests or other, that 20% on social media, to our questioner, that also possesses people, right? Like, oh, I don't want to say something online that's unpopular to my base. So, in some ways, I think we've got to look to the integrity and the intellectual courage as a litmus. And frankly, a leadership at the highest level, be it with a president, and we've got that president right now, who was just in Louisiana, definitely in a community probably not far from others that didn't vote for him. He was in a state that didn't vote for them, but he was communicating and engaging and reestablishing some of that integrity that I think is so, so important to us right now.
Matt,
Can I take a quick stab at this?
The problem today, said it so eloquently just now by Haley and others. And by the way, I miss Steve and Charlie in the Congress. But I think the structural issues are what have created an environment where 80+% of Americans support background checks. 80+% of Americans want the DREAM Act to be passed. 70% of Americans want the voting rights legislation passed, and yet nothing gets done. And so when I say structural issues, I really believe, it's the dirty maps and the dirty money. And we're in a redistricting year now where many states who do not have independent commissions will just protect the party in power. And so you draw these congressional lines where that 20%, as Steve was saying earlier, they're really, really empowered. And when you have unlimited, non-transparent money that can be dumped on the moderate Republican who would say, I want background checks, it's really hard to win in that environment. So I hope we can get the For the People Act passed, which gets rid of the dirty money and the dirty maps. But until we make structural reforms, you're going to continue to have issues where overwhelmingly Americans support them, but because of the structural issues in our democracy, they just won't see action.
Thank you. Jump in.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Congressman Moulton, jump in.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't say. Yeah, no, look, I agree with everything that's been said. And there are huge structural issues with Congress. There's a huge lack of courage in Congress. Many of these Republicans know the right thing to do. They believe in the right thing, but they're just too scared to take that tough vote. But here's a practical approach that I would just throw out there. Because it's a very good question. What do you do about this 20%, right? Well, when you look holistically at Congress, obviously you don't need that 20% on the very far right when you look at the entirety of Congress to vote for the legislation. We just need to get enough moderate Republicans in the middle to get it over the line. So what we can do is be very targeted about the kind of support and the kind of coalitions we build to support those moderate Republicans. I think Eric's point about law enforcement is very well taken. And we have some great law enforcement leaders in my district who do support gun reform. There's no reason we can't expand that coalition. Another coalition to look at is evangelical Christians, who obviously have huge resonance in the Republican Party. They believe in life. They talk about that all the time. And we should reach out to them to bring them in here. Because if we can target not the 20% on the far right, but the 20% of Republicans who are in the middle, but protect them against the 20% in their district, the 20% of their base that might try to throw them out in a primary with real targeted support. That's how we can expand this coalition.
Terrific.
And I'd just like to piggyback on that very quickly. What you've said is really hitting this question. Absolutely, you have targeted the answers correctly. Because there again, how could I ever have been elected in Newt Gingrich's district in Ruby Red, Georgia, running on a gun safety platform? And what we did is we targeted white suburban women who are afraid that they're going to send their children off to school one day and their children are not going to return. They're afraid to be me. And also we targeted moderate Republicans and independents that were willing to listen to the common sense conversations that we were having about gun safety, preventing these kinds of tragedies from happening. and protecting their future generations. And so that's exactly what we are going to have to continue to do, because there are those all across the country now that are afraid of the gun culture. They see and know that it exists far beyond now the urban community, and that no one is immune to it. Each and every community now has seen and heard, the horrific culture that has been brewing. And that's what it is, being able to have those conversations and identifying and targeting those individuals that are malleable enough to listen to the common sense conversations and to stand up and do what's right, and do that by voting for those persons at the polls that have their best interest and safety at heart.
Excellent. You're absolutely. This affects everybody. Congressman Moulton mentioned the evangelical Christian community. Congressman Israel, somebody has directed a question directly to you. Rabbi Bolton asks, does more religious language from the Democratic Party become important to complement all these plans? He's asking you directly.
Yes, to the point. I agree with what was said previously. The evangelical community, spiritual community, religious community, if we can build coalitions and bring them in and speak to issues that are resonant and that they feel so deeply, I think we have a better chance of passing the kind of common sense legislation that we've been discussing. So that was a long-winded way of saying yes.
We have a question from a previous panelist, Dr. Carolyn Light at Harvard. She asks, how do we mitigate the criminalizing tendencies of some of the most popular gun regulations? For example, given the larger context of anti-Black violence and criminalization, the disproportionate criminalization of Black people for infractions that white people tend to evade, such as drug possession, that the very term law-abiding is therefore racially suspect. Who wants to take on that one?
Look, I'm happy to take a quick stab at it. I mean, look, this is a major issue that we also have to address. But much like mental health, it's not an excuse for not addressing guns. Right. I mean, that's the basic answer, I think.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left. Somebody asks, Daniel Kwong asks about Dave Chipman, who's nominated to be the head of the ATF. Do we feel that he's going to get out of the House committee when there's heavy Republican opposition?
Yeah, he's a career law enforcement officer, has a lot of credibility on the issue. He's supported by Brady and many of the gun safety organizations. I think so. I have not heard Manchin or Sinema express concern, and I think he may even be able to bring over a Collins, Murkowski, Toomey.
I agree. I think he's an excellent choice. And as Eric says, he's very, very well respected in all realms of the gun culture. So he's a gun sense champion too.
We're going to wrap up shortly, but I want to sort of end where we began, which was with Congressman Moulton talking about grenades. Somebody says, not too loud, Congressman Moulton, the New Hampshire GOP legislators might propose legalizing hand grenades.
Well, I mean, this is, it sounds like a joke, but maybe it's not in today's world in which we live. The point I'm making, of course, is that we have a long history in America of passing sensible laws to reduce access to very dangerous weapons. We don't allow weapons of war in our communities, with the exception of guns. And you know what? Grenades are useful for fishing. I used to see guys use them in Iraq. Iraqis use them all the time. But we said, you know what? You don't need that in America. And there are a lot of crazy guns that we don't need here too. Will that require some adjustment from people who like to use these weapons? Just like when machine guns were outlawed, I'm sure there are people who missed being able to take their machine gun out in their backyard on a Saturday afternoon. Sure, but it's a reasonable compromise for public safety. I'm sure there are a lot of people who find it to be a real pain to have to go do a driver's test, and they'd rather just be able to, I want to just teach my son to drive a car, and I shouldn't have to have the state check him out. But we've accepted as a society that that's a reasonable precaution that we can all take to ensure public safety. And that's all we're asking here.
That's right. And then very last question, somebody asks with regard to background checks. If you were to buy a firearm from a commercial establishment, you usually have to go through a background check. My question is, how would you enforce it, for example, between the transfers between citizens or relatives?
So there's not going to be.
I'd be happy to address this, Charlie. I'd be happy.
Firearm. Hey, Charlie, go ahead. I want to hear from Charlie.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say on the exceptions. The law in Pennsylvania is, I think, actually a very good one on the issue of transfers of firearms between family members. It basically allows for transfers to be exempted for lineal heirs. So, grandfather to grandson, grandfather to father, then son. That's it. And you can actually tighten that up, although we do not allow exemptions from background checks for transfers between siblings or close friends. I think that's a problem with the Toomey Manchin proposal. It's a little too loose. Define a friend. I think you can actually be a little tighter than most people think, but the exemption again was just for lineal heirs, and I thought that was perhaps the best way to proceed on that matter.
And Matt, the on the private seller to private buyer, I mean, it's still the honor system, right? I mean, we're still a nation where we don't have the police going to every house to say, show me the paperwork for the guns that you bought, or to every dealer, even the firearms dealers, it's an honor system that they are going to follow the law and run the background check. They could just theoretically just sell the gun to you and not do the paper. But, most of them are honorable people that want to follow the law. So I think that's important to express to gun owners that, if you are found to have made a sale without following the law, just as if you were found to have, 10 kilos of cocaine in your car, you're going to pay the price. There'll be a criminal penalty.
Right. I think, overall, first, thank you, everybody, for doing this great panel. I think we could agree that we're making progress on gun issues, but we wish we didn't have to make this much progress. And we still have a little way to go. You've spoken also about the fact that we really need some cultural changes as well, not just legislative, but cultural. And that's super important. So I want to thank everybody for doing this panel. And it's very much appreciated. You're all great leaders on this issue, and we all appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. You're doing a great job.
Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Thank
Go
you.
team.